I once believed the stage could heal everything. The applause, the lights, the laughter. But when the lights went out, I realized silence has its own voice, and sometimes it's louder than fame itself.
Los Angeles, April 1st, 2025. The City of Angels woke up to a silence that felt heavier than usual. News broke that Val Kilmer, the man who once embodied the icy confidence of Top Gun's Iceman, had died at 65 after complications from pneumonia. But for those who had followed his journey, this wasn't just another Hollywood obituary. It was the closing act of a story that had been whispering its farewell for years. In a world obsessed with youth and perfection, Kilmer had refused to vanish quietly. After throat cancer stole his voice, he found new ways to speak, through painting, poetry, and the raw honesty of his 2021 documentary, Val. His tracheostomy made every word an effort, every breath a reminder of mortality. Yet in that broken sound, audiences heard something purer than any line he'd ever delivered on screen: truth. For decades, Hollywood celebrated him as the ultimate chameleon, the fighter pilot, the gunslinger, the saint, the sinner. Behind each transformation stood a man wrestling with his own contradictions, spiritual but stubborn, charming yet volatile, desperate for connection but terrified of compromise. Directors praised his talent and dreaded his perfectionism. He could inhabit any role, except, perhaps, himself. The deeper tragedy wasn't illness or lost fame. It was how the very passion that made him brilliant also kept him alone. When the applause faded, he turned inward, to faith, to art, to forgiveness. The cameras that once worshipped his face now caught a man marked by scars, yet lit from within, as if suffering had purified what fame once distorted. Quote, "I don't sound my name anymore, but I still live it," end quote. He said in one of his final interviews. Those words spread across the world, not because they were poetic, but because they carried the weight of surrender, the kind only learned through pain. Now, months after his passing, the world looks back at Val Kilmer not as the man who lost his voice, but as the artist who taught us that silence can speak louder than fame. And that is where his story truly begins, not in the glory of the spotlight, but in the quiet echo that followed it. Long before the fame, the cameras, and the chaos, there was a boy growing up under the blinding sun of California. Val Edward Kilmer was born in 1959 in Los Angeles, the middle son of a real estate developer and an artist. His childhood, though surrounded by beauty and privilege, was shadowed by fractures that would shape his soul. When he was just 8, his parents divorced, a wound that never quite healed. He once wrote that his father was charming but unpredictable, while his mother carried a sadness he could never name. The Kilmer household was filled with creativity and competition. Val and his brothers built elaborate home movies on 8mm cameras, staging cowboy duels and mock dramas. But beneath the laughter, there was always something darker stirring, a hunger for attention, a yearning to be seen. That craving for recognition, born from emotional absence, would one day fuel both his genius and his downfall. At age 17, tragedy struck when his younger brother Wesley, a gifted filmmaker, drowned in a jacuzzi. It shattered Val. Wesley had been his creative mirror, the one person who truly understood him. After the funeral, Val stopped speaking for days. Friends said it was the moment he turned inward, seeking meaning not in conversation, but in creation. The loss carved a void that no applause could ever fill. In the aftermath, acting became his sanctuary. He won a scholarship to the prestigious Juilliard school, at that time the youngest student ever admitted. Among classmates who would later become legends, Kilmer stood out for his intensity. He studied classical theater with near religious devotion, spending hours dissecting Shakespearean monologues, searching not just for performance, but for truth. Even at 20, he carried himself less like a student and more like a man on a spiritual quest. Teachers at Juilliard remembered him as both brilliant and difficult, passionate, uncompromising, unwilling to accept mediocrity in anyone, including himself. He believed acting wasn't about pretending, it was about becoming. That idea would later define his method and alienate him from directors who weren't ready for that level of immersion. During those formative years, he also began to question the meaning of faith, reading the Bible, Buddhist texts, and the poetry of Rumi. He once said he felt called by something higher, but trapped in something human. That inner tension between the sacred and the self would echo through every performance he ever gave. By the time he left Juilliard in the early 1980s, Val Kilmer was more than an actor in training. He was a seeker, armed with beauty, brilliance, and a restless soul. He had learned how to command a stage, but not yet how to live with himself once the curtain fell. Somewhere deep inside, he was still that boy standing by the edge of a pool, haunted by the silence left after his brother's laughter disappeared.
New York in the early 80s was electric, a chaotic playground for artists, dreamers, and broken souls chasing immortality. Val Kilmer arrived there from Juilliard with a quiet intensity that immediately set him apart. He didn't crave attention, he demanded truth. His classmates joked that Val didn't act, he invoked. And when he stepped on stage, audiences felt it, a presence that could silence a room. His first major breakthrough came on Broadway in Slab Boys, 1983, alongside a young Sean Penn and Kevin Bacon. Kilmer's performance as a troubled youth caught critics' eyes, but even then, whispers circulated about his temperament. He rewrote lines, challenged directors, obsessed over details that others dismissed. What some called arrogance, he considered devotion. "If it's not real," he once said, "why bother doing it at all?" Hollywood took notice. Soon, he landed in comedies like Top Secret and Real Genius, roles that revealed his surprising wit beneath the stoic exterior. But Kilmer wasn't satisfied. He longed for depth, for characters that wrestled with the same shadows he carried inside. That hunger became both his weapon and his wound. Then came 1986, the year everything changed. When Top Gun premiered, it exploded like a cultural supernova. The film turned Tom Cruise into a superstar, but Kilmer's Iceman, cool, confident, untouchable, stole every scene he entered. With a single smirk, he embodied the arrogance and allure of an entire generation. He was the rival audiences secretly rooted for. Overnight, Val Kilmer became a household name. His face was on posters, his lines quoted in locker rooms, his swagger immortalized in slow-motion flight sequences. Yet behind the sunglasses and headlines, he was uneasy. Fame magnified everything: his perfectionism, his insecurities, his inability to switch off the roles he played. While others celebrated, Kilmer questioned what it all meant. Offers poured in: romantic leads, action heroes, artistic experiments. He said no more often than yes. He didn't want to be famous, he wanted to be remembered. In private, he filled journals with poetry, sketches, and fragments of prayers. He was searching for something he couldn't yet name, a purity of purpose that fame kept clouding. Friends recalled how he would disappear between projects, retreating to the desert or the canyons above Malibu, painting and meditating in silence. Val was never built for Hollywood, one co-star said years later. He was built for something deeper, but Hollywood doesn't pay for that. Even at his moment of ascension, the cracks were forming. The boy who sought truth on stage was now being sculpted into an image, handsome, bankable, but misunderstood. The industry wanted Iceman, Val wanted meaning. And somewhere inside that conflict, the tragedy began to take root, quietly, invisibly, behind the flawless mask of a man who seemed to have everything.
By the early 1990s, Val Kilmer was everywhere and nowhere. He had achieved what every young actor dreams of: critical acclaim, box office success, and a face that the camera adored. Yet for those who knew him, there was always that air of restlessness, as if fame were an ill-fitting costume he couldn't quite take off. After Top Gun, Kilmer became Hollywood's most sought-after leading man. He drifted effortlessly between genres, from the sultry world of The Doors, 1991, where he transformed into rock legend Jim Morrison, to the haunting beauty of Tombstone, 1993, where his portrayal of Doc Holliday would become one of the most iconic performances of his generation. Critics said he didn't just play Morrison, he channeled him. He sang every song himself, studied every mannerism, and reportedly stayed in character off-set. Friends began to worry that he was disappearing inside his roles. When Tombstone premiered, Kilmer's performance eclipsed even the film's stars. His gaunt face, his drawl, his dying man wit, it was mesmerizing. Audiences loved him, critics worshipped him, and directors began to whisper that he was a genius. Difficult, unpredictable, but genius nonetheless. That paradox would define the rest of his career. Then came Batman Forever. Taking over the cape and cowl from Michael Keaton, Kilmer entered the Hollywood stratosphere. The film grossed over $300 million worldwide, cementing him as a blockbuster icon, yet he hated nearly every moment of it. The rubber chute made it hard to move, breathe, or even hear. Every conversation began with, "Hi, Batman," and ended before I could respond. He later wrote, "I felt like a prop." Behind the fame, cracks widened. Kilmer's commitment to authenticity clashed with studio control. Rumors of tension with directors followed him from one set to another. The Island of Dr. Moreau, Heat, The Saint. He wasn't chasing fame, he was chasing truth. But truth rarely survives in a billion-dollar business built on illusion. Still, his performances burned with an intensity that few could match. In Heat, 1995, alongside Al Pacino and Robert De Niro, he brought a raw vulnerability to a character who might have been forgettable in lesser hands. He studied Pacino obsessively, learning how stillness could be louder than shouting. For a moment, it seemed as if he had found balance, art and acclaim in harmony. But Hollywood has little patience for the mercurial. His perfectionism, once admired, began to isolate him. Journalists called him difficult. Directors whispered, unstable. Studios grew wary. The same fire that made him magnetic on screen made him combustible off it. Fame had amplified his brilliance and magnified his flaws. By the turn of the millennium, Val Kilmer was both everywhere in the public imagination and increasingly absent from its center. He had conquered every mountain an actor could dream of, yet he seemed untouched by victory. The roles got bigger, the paychecks fatter, but the joy, the pure joy of performing, had begun to fade. He had climbed to the peak, only to discover that the summit was quiet, and in that silence, the ghosts of his past, ambition, grief, faith, and the unhealed boy within, began to speak louder than the applause ever did.
For all his brilliance, Val Kilmer was never built for Hollywood's machinery. He didn't play the game, he questioned it. And in an industry that rewards compliance, that defiance slowly turned him from a legend into a liability. The cracks that began during Batman Forever widened through the late 1990s. On set, Kilmer was demanding to the point of exhaustion, rewriting dialogue, challenging directors, insisting on emotional truth in scenes designed for spectacle. To him, acting was sacred. To the studios, it was business. That conflict poisoned his reputation. Crew members called him intense,
Producers called him impossible. Michael Apted, who directed him in Thunderheart, once said, "Val didn't want to hit his mark, he wanted to find the truth. That's admirable in theater, but in film, truth has a schedule." The line captured Kilmer's curse. He couldn't turn his conviction off. The 1996 production of The Island of Dr. Moreau became the breaking point. The film was chaos even before he arrived, with director changes, rewrites, and clashing egos. Kilmer, originally cast in the lead, switched roles after a pay dispute. When the studio fired the original director, rumors spread that Kilmer's behavior had been the cause. Behind the scenes, he was grieving. His marriage to actress Joanne Whalley was collapsing, and his relationship with his children was strained. The tabloids didn't care. They printed a different story: the diva, the tyrant, the man who ruined a film. By the late 90s, he was still working. The Saint, The Ghost in the Darkness, performances that critics praised, but audiences overlooked. The world had moved on to younger stars, faster franchises. The man who once embodied charisma now walked in the margins, an artist out of time. Then, around 2015, came the diagnosis: throat cancer. The disease that would forever change his life and his art. He resisted treatment at first, insisting that faith alone could heal him. But when breathing became unbearable, he relented. Surgery saved his life, but at a cost. The tracheostomy damaged his voice, leaving him with a rasping whisper. It was a cruel irony. The man who lived through words, who had spent his life mastering tone, cadence, and silence, now struggled to speak. Hollywood, which had once hung on his every line, turned its head. Kilmer disappeared from the spotlight entirely. But somewhere in that darkness, something began to shift. He started documenting his recovery with old home footage, shaping it into something profound, not a comeback story, but a confession. He titled it simply Val. The film, released in 2021, was raw, unfiltered, and devastatingly human. It wasn't about fame. It was about what happens after fame. And it was the first time the world truly met Val Kilmer. Not the star, not the legend, but the man.
By the time Val was released in 2021, the world finally began to understand what fame had taken from Val Kilmer and what it had given him in return. The documentary, pieced together from decades of his own home footage, was a mirror held up to a man who had spent his life performing for others. In it, he appeared frail, with a tube at his throat, but his eyes still burned with the same mischief that once electrified audiences. "I've lived a magical life," he said in a trembling voice, "and I'm still recovering from the miracle of it." It was more than a film. It was a farewell letter written in real time. Fans wept, critics reevaluated him, and even former colleagues who had once dismissed him began to see the humanity behind the myth. Robert Downey Jr. called it the most honest portrait of an actor I've ever seen. For the first time in decades, Val wasn't being talked about as difficult, he was being understood. Yet behind the quiet triumph of Val, his health continued to decline. The cancer went into remission, but the damage to his lungs and throat made him vulnerable to recurring infections. His strength faded, his body betrayed him, but his mind, still sharp, still searching, refused to surrender. He turned his Malibu home into a studio filled with paintings, icons, and poems. Every brushstroke was a prayer, every color a conversation with God. In his final years, he withdrew further from public life, but remained deeply connected to his family. His daughter, Mercedes, became his voice to the world, often reading his thoughts aloud at art exhibits and charity events. "She taught me," she once said, "that silence isn't empty. It's full of meaning if you know how to listen." As 2024 turned to 2025, his health took a turn for the worse. Pneumonia set in, a complication that doctors feared but couldn't stop. For weeks,
he drifted in and out of consciousness, surrounded by his children, old friends, and a few of the spiritual companions who had guided him through the years. He was never alone. Those close to him said he faced death the way he faced life, with curiosity. He wasn't afraid, one longtime friend shared. He said he was going home. On April 1st, 2025, as dawn broke over Los Angeles, Val Kilmer's breathing slowed, then stopped. The city that had once cheered his every move was just beginning another day, unaware that one of its most complex souls had quietly slipped away. There were no cameras, no spotlight, no staged goodbyes, only stillness. When the news reached the world, the reaction was immediate and raw. Tributes poured in from every corner of the industry. Tom Cruise called him a brother in spirit. Kevin Bacon said he played every role like it was his last, and his daughter Mercedes wrote simply, "He's finally free." For a man who lived in the blinding glare of fame, Val Kilmer's end was almost poetic, a fade to silence, not tragedy. He had spent his life chasing truth, and in the end, he found it. And perhaps that was always the point.
When the news of Val Kilmer's death settled into the collective consciousness, the public conversation shifted from shock to gratitude. Suddenly, people weren't talking about the rumors, the clashes, or the labels that had followed him for years. They were talking about the work, the characters that burned their way into memory. Top Gun's Iceman, all arrogance and grace. Tombstone's Doc Holliday, dying yet defiant. The Doors' Jim Morrison, dancing between genius and madness. For decades, Kilmer had been one of those actors who blurred the line between performance and possession. He didn't play roles, he absorbed them. And though that obsession had cost him relationships, comfort, and health, it also gave the world something few actors ever deliver: truth, unfiltered by vanity. Watching his films now feels different. You can see it in his eyes, the searching, the doubt, the longing to understand what it means to be human. His legacy, though, isn't confined to the screen. In his later years, as his body weakened, his art deepened. The paintings he left behind, haunting portraits of angels, deserts, and broken masks, told a story that words could not. His Malibu home, once a retreat from the noise of Hollywood, became a sanctuary filled with color and silence. To walk through it, friends said, was to see the soul of a man who had finally stopped running from himself. Mercedes and Jack, his children, became the stewards of that legacy. They didn't frame it as tragedy, but as transformation. He didn't die from illness, Mercedes said at his memorial. He transcended it. He turned suffering into art. Critics began to reassess his entire career. The same intensity that had once been called difficult was now being recognized as devotion. Younger actors cited him as inspiration, proof that authenticity, though costly, never goes out of style. Directors who once feared working with him now spoke of him with reverence. One said, "He pushed us to feel something real, even when it hurt." In a way, Kilmer's greatest performance wasn't in The Doors or Tombstone or Heat. It was the one he gave after the curtain fell, a man stripped of everything Hollywood valued, who still found beauty in imperfection. Years from now, when people look back at the golden age of American cinema, Val Kilmer's name will not just be listed among the stars. It will stand as a reminder that brilliance often walks hand in hand with solitude, and that sometimes the loudest message an artist can leave behind is silence.
Val Kilmer's story is more than a Hollywood tragedy. It's a mirror, reflecting how an industry built on illusion can both create and consume the people who make it beautiful. He was never meant to be a celebrity. He was meant to be an artist. But in a world that prizes image over truth, that purity came at a cost. In the end, he gave the world something far more valuable than stardom, a portrait of surrender. Through illness, through silence, through loss, he showed that vulnerability isn't weakness. It's the last form of courage left to those who have seen everything. And maybe that's why, long after the lights of Hollywood move on, Val Kilmer's presence will linger in every line, every look, every moment where truth refused to be tamed. Because behind the glory, there was always something deeper, a man still searching for God in the echo of applause.